Be the Zordon of e-commerce. This is a talk by Patrick from Vue Storefront. As you noticed, I didn't say his last name because my Dutch/French/English accent will basically butcher this lovely Polish name. So feel free to phonetically write it in the chat for me. So at the Q&A session, I can actually start using the name properly. Anyways, the talk is about Vue Storefront 2 and how the architecture now works. Very interesting stuff. And the funniest part for me is that he used the Power Rangers theme to explain everything. This is a fun one. Have fun with the talk, and I'll see you in the Q&A session.
Hello everyone, my name is Patrick Andrzejewski and I'm technical leader at Vue Storefront. Today's topic is actually Power Rangers. So we'll be talking about Power Rangers and I'm serious. I want to mention how we created Vue Storefront 2 architecture and why we actually created that and how we can use that when it comes to new projects, when it comes to new online shops. So nowadays, most e-commerce platforms are headless, which means that they are providing the API and the only API. So when it comes to front end, this is something that you have to provide by yourself. So you have to spend some time by building a front end. And in this case, we can call this front end, we can call a head, right? So when you provide a body, which is the APIs, which is the commerce platform, they are headless. So you have to provide a head, right? So the perfect analogy for that is Zordon from very famous series called Power Rangers, right? So the Zordon is just the head guy who is managing his warriors, his rangers, right? And this is where Vue Storefront comes in, right? So we need Zordon to build our online shops, right? So if you are a head, what you would be doing? So what are the responsibilities of being a head? So first of all, you need to take care of the users. You need to take their requests and you need to react on them, right? You need to do some interaction. You need to provide an information from them. You need to pull the data from somewhere and present them to the users, right? So as the Zordon in the movie, you are managing your rangers, right? You are taking care of them. You are actually giving them orders, right? And what are those rangers? So it can be, for example, commerce platform. It can be search engine. It can be, let's say, payment system. So those are a bunch of external services where you are pulling the data and serving that to the user, serving the content to the user, right? And as in the movie, we also have antagonists. We have the enemies, right? So in the context of the software, what are the enemies, right? This is the question. What are the enemies? So the first of all is the performance, right? When it comes to high traffic or something else. So our application, our software needs to be really performant. The user don't want to wait for your application. They want to see the content immediately, right? They want to do some interaction. They want to click on this, right? And also your application needs to be really easy to search in the web search engines such as Google, right? So you need to take care of the SEO and all of this stuff. We can call this as an enemy because we have to do everything we can to provide the best performance, right? When it comes to our application. What about the usage? So when we create a front-end software, so it would be nice to really use that, right, in your application, in your project, right? Which means that we have to actually design the best developer experience we can, right? So because when you are building new project, you want to be focused on the business logic that you want to really implement. You don't want to spend time on documentation. You want to spend time on the Google and the browsing the solution, the perfect solution for your case. You want to use the really intuitive developer API that is well designed and easy to use in your project, right? And then lastly, you want to be, let's say, compatible with the entire ecosystem, right? So let's say you're using one integration, let's say Magento, which means we are using one backend platform in your project, right? And one day you want to use something else with Magento, alongside Magento, right? Let's say payment system, external, for example, search engine. So it should be easy to connect that external third-party integration to your backend, and all of those bunch of integrations should cooperate together and actually send it the content to your users, right? So to solve all of these problems, we need architecture, right? We need something that actually will collect all of these specific components together and make them work together, right? So we need something that even dictates what all of the components should look like, right? So when it comes to Vue Storefront, of course, we have created such an architecture. Maybe that's not perfect, but actually works for us perfectly. And let's define the components that we have in our Vue Storefront architecture. So on the base, we have a Next.js, right? Next.js, it's actually a framework on top of Vue.js, and we base all of the Vue Storefront on this, right? So when you create a new project based on Vue Storefront, this is the project that is actually a project of Next.js, right? So you don't have to learn anything new. You are building the application as it used to be, as it normally is, right? And you're using the API that you already know, right? So you are not using anything totally new. Actually, the Vue Storefront is like Next.js and some additional libraries. This is the perfect actually description of what the Vue Storefront is. So what's the next thing? The next thing is core. And the core actually is the place, is the actually library that influences everything else. This is the component that defines, that actually dictates what everything else should look like, right? This is the contract between every single component, between the components, and how they should cooperate together. Next thing is the team. In our architecture, the team is the agnostic one, which means that we have one team for all of the integrations, right? So if we have another integration, a new integration, our team, our template will stay the same, right? The next thing is API client. And the API client is like SDK for third-party services. It's like set of the functions, and one function in this set is responsible for one API endpoint, maybe sometimes two, but usually it's one API client function. It means one endpoint in the third-party services. It's kind of abstraction that allows you to use that to actually make API calls on your application. And last thing is composable. When it comes to frontend, last thing is composables, and composables are composition API functions. And one composition API function, one composable actually defines one feature, right? So let's say when you have a card, you have a composable called use card. When you have a product, you have a composable called use product, and so on and so on, right? So one composable function means one feature, one commerce feature in this case. And when it comes to backend side, because we have something like let's say backend side, we have a middleware, and a middleware in this entire architecture is like backend for the frontend. So he's actually responsible for managing the API calls, implement some extensions, making connections to the third-party services, and so on and so on. Right. So this is the overall architecture when it comes to Vue Storefront. Now let's go one by one deeply and explain every single component underneath. So how we can actually interact with that. So first thing, what's the core, or what's inside of the core? So first of all, the core has factories, and the factories defines how the composables should look like, right? So for example, when you define new composables, so in like 90% cases, you will have to do the same actually logic, because you have to take care of the loading states. You always have to care about error handling, maybe sometimes the context and so on, and other like bunch of things that looks like quite repetitive. So we have created a bunch of factories. And when it comes to implementing a new composable, so you don't have to build them from scratch, you can use the factories, you can provide the specific parameters, and that's it. You are focusing on the implementing the logic when it comes to specific integration. So you don't have to build this from scratch. You're using just the core factories. The next thing is types, interfaces, or agnostic types. And those are defining the very granular types when it comes to commerce platforms, such as price, such as, for example, maybe an item in the gallery, and so on and so on. And to transfer something from the commerce platform to the agnostic type, we're using getters, right? So we are actually, the getters are sort of selectors that are getting something from the response that comes in from the commerce platform, and we are transferring that to agnostic type, right? And lastly, we have utilities, some utilities functions or maybe types as well, that defines for you sort of logic that can be in common use. For example, shrink state between the views, server-side rendering, accessing the context, the views VSF context, maybe some helpers when it comes to integration, when it comes to writing and integration, and so on and so on. So this is the core. Okay. So what's the next? So the next thing is theme. So this one is agnostic one, as I mentioned, is placed inside of the core directory in our repository. It's actually part of the core as well. And let's say, let's define maybe the product page, right? So this is the code that you can see right now. This is the product page. So how it looks like. So please notice that I'm importing the integration. I'm going to use product, use card, product getters, and use reviews. Those are the composables from some integration. But the import here is EJS statement, which means that in the build time, I'm replacing this import to the specific integration, right? So you can place here, for example, integration commerce tools. I can place here Shopify, Magento, and so on and so on. But the implementation is different, of course, but the API stays the same, right? So now I can use those composables, and independently on the integration, I can use those composables in the same way, right? This is super powerful because I can use those composables in the same way always, right? So in this case, for example, I'm using use product and I'm using use card, which means this is the category page, right? So I will be reading something from the API. In this case, this is the product. And then I will be interacting with the card. So I want to, for example, add an item to the cart, right? So that's why I'm using those composables. Now you have a bunch of getters. In this case, I'm getting some information from the original response, and I'm transferring that to agnostic types. In this case, I'm getting one variant. So that's why I'm using a getter called getFiltered. So I'm using one variant, which is the default one or master one, and I want to display this on the theme. And then I'm using the options when it comes to the available options of the given product, and I'm actually sharing those fields instead of my team. And my team can stay the same because all of these fields contains the agnostic types, right? This is how it looks like. So now API client. So how the API client looks like. So when it comes to creation, it looks more or less like this, because in general, when you create a new API client, for example, when you define a new integration, when you create a new API client, you have to define a bunch of functions that are interacting with external third-party service. One function means one API call, sometimes maybe more, but usually one function means one API call. So let's maybe define this API client. So first of all, of course, you have to import our factory, right? Which is the API client factory. You have to use that, and you have to call this, right? So now you have to provide all of the required fields when it comes to API client factory. And the first one is onCreate. OnCreate is the function that actually defines for you a connection between API client and the third-party service. So this is the place where actually you are defining an instance of the connection, an instance of the SDK from given platform, an instance of let's say some client, for example, Apollo client when it comes to GraphQL, right? And so on and so on. So this is in this context, for example, as an example, I'm creating an Axios instance, so I can use that across all of the functions in terms of API client. So now we have a section that provides for us those functions that I mentioned before. And for example, I'm defining an add to cart function, and I can interact inside of the implementation of this function. I can interact with the external third-party service. So in this context, I'm, for example, using the API post call to some external service when it comes to other, let's say, third-party commerce platform, right? So please notice that when I'm using context.client, I'm actually using the client that I defined in the onCreate function, right? So this is the same connection. This is the way how I can access this client, this connection to the external commerce platform. And each time when you define a new function, you always have an access to the client with using the context, right? The context is always the first argument in this way. But of course, remember when you are using the API client normally, the context will be actually skipped, right? You don't have to pass this always when you're using API client. We are doing this automatically. So, for example, when you call API client, so please notice that the context is hidden inside of this API client functions, right? So using this normally just with the parameters and nothing else, right? So now composables, and the composables are implementing one specific feature. So let's say we want to define a cart. So of course, again, we are using factory from the core. In this case, we are importing use cart factory because we want to define the cart feature. And we have to call this, of course. And then we have to define the factory params. So those are the set of the parameters that we have to define to implement this feature properly, right? So for example, we want to load the cart, of course, and we want to add item to the cart, right? And inside of this function, we can do every logic that we want to do when it comes to one specific function, right? Always they are just API calls to the external service, and this is the place where we are using API client that we defined beforehand, right? But in this place, please notice that I'm using the context call, right? So inside of the context, which is always the first argument again, I have an access to the API client instance. Actually, it's not the real instance. I will be mentioning that when it comes to middleware later. But right now, you can think that there is an instance of the API client, and this is accessible with using the context, right? So I can call the API with using my API client that I defined beforehand on the previous slides, right? This is the same function. Of course, please notice that I'm also skipping the context, right? So I'm using this function normally, and but this is the place where I can access some other component. In this context, is API client that I defined beforehand, right? This is accessible from this place. And now, finally, middleware, which is the backend for the front end. So how this middleware look like? So maybe to sum up what we have mentioned so far. So we have API client, right? One client dedicated for one integration, but also for one integration, also the composables, right? So composables are using always the API client, right? This is something that we have learned so far. And this is integration, right? So composables and the API client means one integration, right? We can have more integrations. We can define another integration, right? So on the left side, we have integration. We have the actually code that represent the integration. And on the right side, we have also services, right? In the cloud or somewhere in the world, right? And in the middle, we have, as the name indicates, middleware. And how this traffic goes through the middleware. So we have something like that, right? But as you can see, I placed API client inside of the middleware. So what does it mean? It means that I'm using RPC calls, right, for both integrations. And as you remember on the previous slides, I have used something like context dot some tag name. It was just the city, which means the commerce was in this context. And then I'm calling the add some function. In this case is add to cart, right? But when you call something like that on the front end side, the Vue Storefront will be transferring that to something like this. So that's why I mentioned that you are calling a stub when it comes to front end. So there is no API client. The API client lives within the middleware. But on the front end side, you just actually sending the instruction to the middleware, and the middleware takes the job actually, and he's calling everything that we need when it comes to data. So what this statement means? So this $CT, this is the short name of the integration, right? In this case, this is the commercials, which is the CT, right? So at the beginning, you are sending the request to the middleware, and you are asking the middleware to load the API client from the commercials integration, right? This is what the CT means in this case, right? So you are telling the middleware, hey, I want to load the commercials integration. Next thing, that from the commercials integration, I want to call add to cart function. Please do this for me. And I want to call that function with those arguments, right? And this is how it works. So on the front end, there is no API client. There is just a proxy or just a stub, just a library actually that is pretending that there is API client. You normally have hints when it comes to typing that there is API client, because we are providing the TypeScript types for this. But the real API client lives within the middleware. And you can provide as many API functions as you want, and you can connect as many integrations as you want. And no matter how many integrations you are using and how many functions you are defining, they will not impact the final bundle size, because the API client is not provided to the browser, right? And this is one of the reasons why we have created that middleware. Because, yeah, exactly. What are the reasons why we created something like that? So first of all is the bundle size, right? So when you're using just a single integration, it's totally fine. But if your front end, if your commerce platform, and is using more than one integration, for example, 2 or 3 or maybe more, so it means that you can increase the bundle size sometimes even dramatically, all right? Some of the commerce platform or third-party services provides its own SDK, and of course it has its own size, right? So always when you integrate something new, you are increasing the bundle size, right? But always it's only about the interaction. It's only about the making of calls, right? So you can delegate the job to the middleware. This is the first thing. Next thing is the security. Some of the commerce platforms, some of the external services provides for you credentials, right? And you don't want to share that credentials to the front end, right? And the middleware is perfect place for this, right? So you don't have to define your own middleware. You can use ours, and you can put those credentials in the middleware, right? And the last one is the extensions. In the extensions, you can you have a ability to control like everything that is related to the API client, which means everything that is related to making a request and taking the response from the third-party services. So this is how the middleware in general looks like, right? And what's worth to mention, because everything like that by default is working in the one process. So when you run Vue Storefront, the API is available within the /API. This is the middleware, right? And this is one process. It's possible because Next.js allows us to do something like that. So we can attach another process to the Vue Storefront application. But also, if you need that, you can run this middleware as a separated app. So it can be independent of the front-end layer. So you can disconnect that and run this even on the totally separate server, totally separate Docker container, whatever. And you can scale this separately. So you have actually 2 modes of running this. The first one is connected together to the front end, and the next one is independent applications, right? So the front end can be independent and middleware can be independent. But what about the extensions? So what you can do with extensions? So maybe let's define one extension. So the extension looks like this. And first of all, each extension has a name. The name is like unique identifier of the extension, right? So this is actually all when it comes to name, just the identifier. The next thing is extend API methods, and this is the place where you can define your own API client functions, or you can override the original ones. Let's say you have add to cart function from our integration, right? And actually you want to extend that, or you want to override this, right? For example, you want, before you add something to the cart, you want to call additional service in your infrastructure. So this is the place where you can define something like that. So instead of the extend API methods, you can define, you can override the original function, and before you call the original logic that is imported from original integration, you can make a call to your own service. Or, as I mentioned, you can define your own API client function, and you can successfully use that in the front end, right? Next thing is extend app, because our middleware is based on Express.js application. We have used that because we didn't want to use anything like sophisticated. The Express.js is perfect for this. So we have, within the extend app, you have access to the app, and you can do with the Express anything you want. This is the instance of the application from the Express, and you can define everything you want when it comes to Express.js. The next section is hooks, and the hooks is basically a function. And in the arguments of that function, you have a request and the response that also comes from the Express.js. So you have full access of the cookies, request headers, response headers, and so on, right? And this function must return an object with the set of the hook functions. So in this object, you have a bunch of functions, and each one is actually represents the life cycle of API client. The first one is before create, and is being called before we create a connection when it comes to API client, and we can change the configuration. So we can change the initial configuration when it comes to connection, right? The next thing is after create, and this is mostly the same thing, but when you change the configuration in this case, that doesn't influence the final connection, right? So that configuration will be available within the API client functions, but it will not impact the original connection. So that's the difference between those two. Next thing is before call, and this one is being called before we're making a call of the API client function. So if you want to change, let's say, the arguments of the given function, so this is the place where you can do this. In the call name, we have a name of the function that is being called right now at this moment. So we can put the if statement, and we can capture the exactly function that we want to change, that we want to change the arguments for, and we can do this in the before call. After calls, it's mostly the same to the before call, but instead of the arguments, we can do something with the response. So when we call the function, and when we get the response for the original third-party service, we can do something with the response. And again, we can put the if statement for the call name, and you can capture the exactly function that we want, and we can change some response when it comes to that. And this is how it looks like. This is the entire architecture, right? So the question is, what about the future? So of course, our architecture is something that we constantly work on. We want to provide the best solution we can. Right now, it's mostly stable, and our customers is using that. Our customers are using that. So, but we constantly work on this, right? Because we want to cover as many cases as it's possible. We want to cover as many features as is possible, at least the common ones, right? So we want to solve most of the common issues when it comes to creating e-commerce projects, right? So you want to work on this. We want to provide the best solution we can when it comes to, first of all, developer experience, performance, and basically fun of use in general. So that's all from my side, and thank you. So right now is the time for the questions.